The finality of the oak door closing was not a sound, it was a physical blow, a pressure in the air that pushed the breath from Alara's lungs. On the other side stood Elias, her husband's brother, his face a mask of grim duty. In her palm, pressed there by his wife, were 3 silver dollars. They were cold and heavy, a payment for a life that was no longer hers. The farm, the house her Thomas had built, the fields they had cleared together, all of it now belonged to Elias. The law was on his side. A woman alone had no claim. She stood on the porch, the dust of the yard swirling around the hem of her worn dress. The community of Providence Creek watched. Some looked away, ashamed. Others whispered, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was 22 years old, a widow of 2 months, and now an exile. All she had left in the world was what she could carry, a canvas sack with a change of clothes, a small skillet, and a heavy woodsman's axe that had been Thomas's pride. And the deed. Elias had thrust it at her as a final, almost cruel gesture of settlement, a folded brittle paper for 160 acres of high, worthless land in the stony hills north of the valley. Thomas had bought it in a fit of optimism, dreaming of a summer pasture that never came to be. Everyone knew it was useless, a patch of rock, clay, and wind-stunted pine. Elias called it the widow's folly. The paper felt like a mockery in her hands. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, stepped forward, his expression one of practiced sympathy. He was a man who measured the world in profit and loss. "Alara," he said, his voice low and reasonable, "there's a wagon heading east tomorrow. I'll give you $1 for that deed, enough for a ticket to someplace with a real future." His offer hung in the air, a sensible, logical escape. Go east, start over. Forget this harsh land that had taken her husband and her home. But as she looked at the faces around her, faces of people who had shared bread with her, who had watched her marry, who now saw her as a problem to be solved, a cold, hard knot formed in her belly. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something heavier. It was resolve. She looked not at Mr. Gable, but past him, toward the distant, hazy line of the northern hills. "I'll need salt," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. "And a bag of flour, a sharpening stone for the axe, and a good wool blanket." A silence fell over the small crowd. This was not the response of a defeated woman. This was the response of someone preparing, not fleeing. Mr. Gable's jaw tightened slightly. He had offered charity, and she had answered with a shopping list. He led her into the store. The silver dollars, one by one, landed on the polished countertop with a definitive click. Salt, flour, stone, blanket. Her entire worldly fortune converted into the raw materials of survival. She did not buy passage east. She bought a future in the one place she had left. She walked out of the store, her sack now heavy on her back, and went to the livery. The last of her money went to reclaim Patience, the sturdy gray mule she and Thomas had raised from a foal. The animal nudged her hand, a familiar, comforting presence in a world that had suddenly become alien. Without a backward glance at the town or the farm, she turned north. She put her hand on the mule's flank and began to walk. The whispers followed her until she was out of earshot. The words, "foolish," "doomed," and "the widow's folly" chasing her up the dusty road. But Alara did not hear them. She was listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of her own footsteps and the soft plod of the mule beside her. She was walking toward her worthless land. The journey was a punishment. The gentle slopes of the valley gave way to a landscape of sharp inclines and broken rock. The rich black soil was replaced by a thin, gritty layer of earth that barely supported gnarled oaks and thorny brush. Patience, sure-footed and steady, picked her way through the terrain, the supplies shifting on her back. Alara walked beside her, the handle of the axe clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. The weight of her sack dug into her shoulders, a constant reminder of how little she had. For 2 days they climbed. The air grew thinner, colder. The world became a vast, silent expanse of gray stone and blue sky. She felt her isolation not as a fear, but as a fact, as tangible as the rocks under her feet. There were no other homesteads here, no curls of smoke on the horizon. The people of Providence Creek were right. No one in their right mind would try to make a life in this place. On the evening of the second day, she found the survey marker, a weathered wooden stake driven into the ground, a pile of rocks at its base. This was it, her inheritance, her folly. She stood at the edge of the property and felt a wave of despair so profound it made her knees weak. Before her lay a sunken, miserable hollow, a great scooped-out bowl at the base of a towering bluff of pale, lifeless clay. The bottom of the hollow was a mess of mud and stagnant water, choked with cattails and buzzing with insects. A few skeletal pines clung to the rim, their branches twisted by a wind that never seemed to stop. It was not a place to build a home, it was a place to be buried. The town's mockery echoed in her mind. A worthless hole, a swamp. Mr. Gable's offer of $1 for the deed suddenly seemed generous. She slid to the ground, the heavy sack falling beside her. The exhaustion of the journey, the grief of her loss, the hopelessness of her situation, it all came crashing down on her. Tears, hot and sharp, stung her eyes. For a long, bleak moment, she believed they were all right. She was a fool, and this place would be her end. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, the temperature dropped like a stone. A cold wind scoured the hollow, sharp and unforgiving. Shivering, Alara pulled the new wool blanket around her shoulders and pressed herself against the base of the massive clay bluff, seeking any small protection from the biting air. Patience stood nearby, her head low, her breath pluming in the twilight. And then she felt it. It was subtle at first, easily missed, but through the rough fabric of her dress and the thickness of the blanket, she felt a strange and persistent sensation. It was not warmth, not like a fire. It was an absence of cold. The clay wall behind her, which should have been leaching the heat from her body, was instead neutral, almost temperate. The wind howled over the rim of the hollow, but down here, at the base of the bluff, the air was still. Curiosity stirred through her despair, a tiny flickering ember. She pressed her bare palm flat against the clay. It was cool, but not the biting, icy cold of the surrounding rock. It felt dense, solid, permanent. She rose and began to walk along the base of the bluff, her hand trailing against the wall. The stillness persisted. The entire hollow was a natural shield against the wind, a giant's cradle protected from the world. A sound, faint but clear, reached her ears. Drip, drip, drip. She followed it to a fissure in the rock face, half hidden by a curtain of hardy moss. From the crack, a tiny, steady stream of water trickled down, clean and clear. It was the source of the mud in the hollow, but it was also life. It was water that would not freeze in winter, emerging from deep within the earth. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of stone and minerals. She looked at the water, then at the still air, then at the massive wall of clay. The pieces began to click into place in her mind. The town saw a muddy pit. Thomas had seen a folly, but the earth was showing her something else. The hollow wasn't a flaw, it was a fortress. The clay wasn't barren, it was a blanket. The water wasn't a nuisance, it was a pulse. Despair did not vanish, but it receded, pushed back by a grim, burgeoning idea. She would not build on this land. She would build in it. She would carve her home out of the very thing everyone called worthless. The wind howled above her, but down in the hollow, Alara stood in the quiet, and for the first time since the oak door had closed, she felt the faintest glimmer of a fighting chance. The work began at dawn. It was a brutal, relentless assault on the earth, and the earth fought back. Her first task was to manage the water. Using the sharp edge of her axe head as a crude spade, she began to dig a trench, redirecting the constant seep away from the center of the hollow. The mud was thick and heavy, a sucking, greedy mire that clung to her boots and her clothes. Each shovelful was a dead weight that strained the muscles in her back and shoulders until they screamed in protest. Within hours, her hands were raw. By the end of the first day, blisters had formed, broken, and bled, leaving weeping sores on her palms. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her spare dress, but the damp clay soaked through, grinding into her wounds. She worked until the last light failed, falling into an exhausted sleep under the wool blanket, every inch of her body aching, with a pain so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. The next day and the day after, the labor continued. She dug a wide, deep channel, lining it with flat stones she pried from the hillside. This channel guided the water to a deeper pit at the far end of the hollow, which she intended to turn into a cistern. She was not just digging a ditch, she was sculpting the land, imposing her will upon it. The sheer physicality of the task was overwhelming. Sometimes she would stop, leaning on the axe handle, her body trembling with exhaustion, and wonder if she could possibly continue. But then she would look at the steady trickle of water, feel the stillness of the air, and she would pick up the axe and dig again. Once the water was controlled, she turned to the shelter itself. She chose a spot at the deepest curve of the bluff, where the overhang was most pronounced. She would dig into the base of the clay wall, creating a home that was more cave than cabin. The work was slower, harder than digging in the mud. The clay was dense, compacted by millennia of pressure. She chipped away at it with the axe, the impacts jarring her arms to the shoulder. She hauled the excavated clay out in her skillet, handful by handful, a Sisyphean task that seemed to stretch into eternity. After 2 weeks of this punishing labor, she had carved out a shallow alcove, no bigger than a closet. It was a start, but not enough. She needed wood. Leaving patients to graze in a grassy patch she had found a mile away, Ilara climbed to the rim of the hollow and began to fell the stunted lodgepole pines. Thomas had taught her how to use the axe, how to read the lean of a tree and make the cuts clean and true. But knowing how was different from doing it. The axe, which had felt so balanced in his hands, was a clumsy, heavy weapon in hers. Her first few swings were wild, glancing off the bark. But she persisted, her blows becoming more rhythmic, more accurate. The sharp crack of the axe echoed in the silent hills. When the first tree finally groaned and crashed to the ground, she sank to her knees, gasping for breath, a fierce, painful pride swelling in her chest. Getting the logs down into the hollow was another trial. They were too heavy to carry. She had to roll them, guiding them down the steep incline, dodging them as they tumbled and bounced. It was dangerous, reckless work. More than once she narrowly avoided being crushed. By the time she had 10 suitable logs at the bottom, she was covered in scrapes and bruises. She built a low, rectangular frame at the front of her excavated alcove, the back of the structure being the clay bluff itself. She notched the logs with painstaking care, fitting them together as tightly as she could. It was crude work, the gaps between the logs, wide and uneven. This was where the land's second gift came into play. She mixed the clay she had dug out with dry grass and dung from patients, adding water from the seep until it formed a thick, heavy paste. This was cob, an ancient building material. She began packing it into the gaps between the logs, her raw hands working the mud into every crack and crevice. Then she went further, plastering the mixture over the entire exterior of the log walls, building it up layer by layer until the wood was completely encased in a thick, earthen shell. The structure began to look less like a cabin and more like a natural formation, a great mound of earth growing out of the hillside. She built a roof frame from smaller logs, laying a thick mat of pine boughs over it, and then she began hauling clay up to cover that as well, creating a living roof that would insulate and protect. Her world shrank to the rhythm of this work. Dig, haul, mix, pack. Her body adapted, her muscles hardening into tight cords, her skin becoming calloused and tough. The small victories were what kept her going. The first wall completed, the roof sealed against the rain, the day she finally finished the stone-lined cistern and had a reservoir of clean, clear water. Section. She built a fireplace and chimney directly against the back wall of the bluff, using flat stones mortared with more clay. It was the heart of the home. The clay wall behind it would become a massive thermal battery, soaking up the heat from the fire and radiating it back into the small space long after the flames had died down. But survival required more than just shelter and warmth. It required food. Inside the dugout, against the back wall where the earth's temperature was most stable, she built 3 long, shallow boxes from leftover pine slabs. Then began the arduous task of filling them. She found a patch of richer soil in a depression a quarter-mile away. Using her sack, she hauled it, 50 pounds at a time, back to the hollow and up to her home, filling the boxes with the precious black earth. It was a subterranean garden, a madman's dream of growing food in the dark. She knew she needed more supplies, more food and livestock. With a deep sense of dread, she knew she had to return to Providence Creek. She loaded Patience with a few dozen well-shaped clay bricks she had molded and fired in her hearth, a test and her only currency. Her arrival in town caused a stir. She was thinner, harder, her face browned by the wind, her hands scarred. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a wild thing that had come down from the hills. She went directly to the mercantile. Mr. Gable stared at her, his eyes wide. "By God, you're alive." "I need supplies," Ilara said, ignoring his shock. She laid one of the bricks on his counter. It was heavy, solid, and fired to a deep terracotta red. "I need 3 laying hens, a piglet, and as many seed potatoes and turnips as this will buy me." He picked up the brick, weighing it in his hand. He was impressed, but also baffled. "Girl, what are you building up there? A fortress? What in heaven's name are you going to feed a pig with?" "That's my concern," she said flatly. The transaction was made. As she led her small menagerie, 3 squawking hens in a crate on Patience's back, a squealing piglet in a sack, and another sack filled with root vegetables. Out of town, the whispers followed her again. They were no longer pitiful, but mocking. They had a name for her now, the Mad Woman in the Hills. On the long journey back, as she camped for the night, a new creature entered her life. A dog, a scruffy mix of breeds with ribs showing and wary eyes, crept to the edge of her firelight, drawn by the smell of the bacon she was frying. He was skittish but desperate. Ilara tossed him a piece of meat. He snatched it and vanished into the darkness. The next morning he was there, trailing 50 yards behind her on the path. He followed her all the way back to the hollow. When she finally reached her strange, earthen home, he sat at a distance watching. She put out a bowl of water and a little food. That night a cold wind blew, and the dog crept into the shelter of the doorway. Ilara didn't send him away. She named him Shadow, and from that day on she was no longer entirely alone. Her small, self-contained world now had a guardian. One afternoon a rider appeared on the ridge above the hollow. It was Elias. He had come, he would later claim, to see if she was still alive. But the smirk on his face told a different story. He was there to confirm her failure, to see the ruins of her foolish pride. He stared down at the strange, lumpy mound of mud and logs, the thin curl of smoke rising from a chimney that seemed to grow right out of the bluff. He saw Ilara emerge, her clothes stained with clay, followed by a scruffy dog. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. He didn't even bother to ride down. He just laughed, a loud booming sound that echoed off the clay walls. "Is that your house?" he shouted, his voice dripping with condescension. "It looks like a mud dauber's nest." Ilara said nothing. She just watched him until he turned his horse and rode away, still chuckling. When he returned to Providence Creek, he had a story to tell. He told everyone in the saloon, in the mercantile, in the churchyard, about his mad sister-in-law. He described her hovel with cruel relish. "She's living in a mud nest," he declared, slapping the bar for emphasis, "like some kind of animal, burrowing into the dirt to die." The name stuck. It was memorable, descriptive, and cruel. From that day forward, her home was the Mud Nest. The woman who lived there became the Mud Nest Woman. The name was a weapon designed to cement her status as an outcast, a fool whose story would serve as a cautionary tale. The community used it with casual derision, a shorthand for failure and delusion. But inside the shelter, Ilara was deaf to their mockery. Her life was governed not by gossip, but by the relentless rhythms of survival as winter closed in. The first snows came, dusting the hills in white. The world outside grew quiet and cold. Her world, however, shrank to a small, warm, living space. Her days fell into a strict routine. At dawn, she would rise in the dim light that filtered through the two small glass-paned windows she had painstakingly set into the southern wall. Her first task was always the fire. She would add logs to the glowing embers in the stone hearth, the steady warmth a bulwark against the frigid air outside. The thick clay wall behind the fireplace was always warm to the touch, a massive, gentle radiator that heated the entire space. She had built a connected dugout for the animals, a small cavern off the main room. The body heat from Patience, the pig, and the chickens helped warm the entire structure. Her morning routine involved feeding them, milking the one goat she'd managed to acquire in another trade for bricks, and collecting the precious, miraculous eggs from the hens. The pig rooted contentedly in a pen filled with dirt and vegetable scraps. They were not just livestock, they were living furnaces and a vital source of food. Her subterranean garden flourished in the stable, cool temperature. The potatoes, turnips, and carrots grew slowly but steadily in their beds of black soil. Hardy greens, kale and chard, provided a constant source of fresh leaves. It was a miracle of green life in a world of white death, sustained by the earth's own latent warmth and the water from the seep, which she now piped directly into the shelter through a hollowed log channel. Her world was one of sensory details, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, the soft clucking of the hens, the sound of Shadow's tail thumping against the floor, the taste of a hot potato baked in the coals of the fire. She was utterly alone, miles from any other human being, yet her life was full. She was not just surviving, she was presiding over a tiny, intricate ecosystem of her own creation. Winter tested her systems. A pack of wolves, driven by hunger, descended from the high peaks. Their howls echoed through the hollow one night, a sound that would have terrified anyone in a normal cabin. Shadow stood at the door, a low, rumbling growl in his chest, his hackles raised. But the wolves could find no purchase on the thick earthen walls. The single, heavy door she had built from split logs was barred from the inside. They circled for hours, their shadows flitting past the windows, but they could not get in. By morning, they were gone. The mud nest had held. Another time, a week-long thaw was followed by a sudden, deep freeze. The water on her roof turned to a thick sheet of ice. The weight was immense. She listened to the groans of the log beams above her, her heart in her throat. She expected a collapse, but the structure, half supported by the earth itself, settled and held. The ice became another layer of insulation. These small trials were lessons. She learned to bank the fire just right to keep a steady heat all night. She learned how to ration her food, how to mend her clothes, how to read the sky for signs of a coming storm. Her confidence grew not from pride, but from the quiet, daily proof that her systems worked. The town could call her a fool. They could laugh at her mud house. But she was warm. She was fed. She was safe. Then came the blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like a normal storm, it descended like a judgment. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue, turned to a flat, bruised gray in the space of an hour. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that quickly rose to a high, vicious shriek. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in a solid, horizontal wall of white that erased the world. Ilara was prepared. Her firewood was stacked high against the inner wall, dry and seasoned. Her cistern was full, her animals were secure. She barred the door, checked the chinking around her windows, and added another log to the fire. Shadow lay at her feet, his head on his paws, seemingly untroubled. From inside the mud nest, the storm was a distant, roaring beast, a rage that could not touch them. The thick clay walls absorbed the sound of the wind, muffling it to a dull hum. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warm, fire-lit cave, the smell of baking bread, and the soft sounds of her animals. In Providence Creek it was a different story. The blizzard was not a storm, it was an enemy laying siege to the town. The wind, armed with ice and snow, was a physical force that tore at the wooden cabins. It found every crack, every loose board, every poorly sealed window. It clawed its way inside, a thief stealing warmth and life. The temperature plummeted, first to 0, then to 10 below, then to a mind-numbing 35 degrees below 0. At that temperature, metal became brittle. Wood groaned and cracked. The very air felt sharp enough to cut the lungs. The town's confidence, built on sturdy log walls and ample firewood, shattered in a matter of days. The conventional cabins, which had seemed so robust, bled heat like wounded animals. Families huddled around their fireplaces, feeding them constantly, but the cold seeped through the floors and walls. Firewood supplies, meant to last for months, were devoured in a week. The community's systems collapsed. Pipes froze and burst. The roof of the meeting hall cracked under a mountain of snow. Livestock, left in barns that offered little more than a windbreak, began to freeze to death where they stood. Mr. Gable's Mercantile, the most well-built structure in town, was a fortress of cold. The glass in his front windows, thick as a man's thumb, contracted in the brutal freeze and shattered, spraying shards across the floor. The cold invaded his sanctuary. Panic gave way to a quiet, freezing despair. The town was trapped. No one could leave. No one could get help. They were isolated in a sea of white, their homes becoming tombs of ice. The mockery they had directed at Ilara was a distant memory, replaced by the immediate, terrifying reality of their own folly. They had built for normal winters, for a world they understood. They had not built for this. Meanwhile, in the hollow, Ilara was not fighting the storm. She was simply living outside its reach. The earth that surrounded her was a perfect insulator. The several feet of snow that buried her roof only added to it. The fire in her hearth needed only a few logs a day to keep the space at a steady, comfortable temperature. The thermal mass of the clay bluff did its work, hoarding the heat and releasing it slowly, evenly. She was warm. Her animals were calm. Her water still trickled from the earth. While the world of men froze and broke, her small, strange world held. On the 4th day of the blizzard, a new sound broke through the muffled roar of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy wooden door. Shadow leaped to his feet, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Ilara quieted him with a hand on his back. No animal made a sound like that. It was human. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Who could possibly be out in this? She slid the heavy wooden bar from its brackets and pulled the door inward. A figure, more a sculpture of snow and ice than a man, stumbled across the threshold and collapsed onto the earthen floor. She dragged him further inside, shutting the door against the swirling vortex of white. As she brushed the snow from his face, her breath caught in her throat. It was Mr. Gable. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His face was a ghastly white. the telltale sign of severe frostbite. He was barely conscious, his body racked with violent shivers. Ilara worked quickly. She cut away his frozen coat, wrapped him in her own wool blanket, and propped him up near the fire. She forced hot, sweet tea between his cracked lips. For a long time he could only moan, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Shadow watched from a distance, whining softly, sensing the gravity of the situation. When Mr. Gable could finally speak, his voice was a raw, broken whisper. "The town. Ilara. The town is dying." He told her of the freezing cabins, the dwindling firewood, the sickness. His own wife, he choked out, was ill with a fever, and their young daughter was fading. Their cabin was an icebox. He had run out of wood 2 days ago and had been burning furniture to stay alive. In a final, desperate act, he had set out for the one place he could think of that might still have a fire, the mad woman's nest in the hills. He had followed the faint trace of her smoke, a journey that had nearly cost him his life. He looked around her shelter, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the gentle warmth, the calm animals, the impossible garden. He touched the clay wall, feeling the deep, radiant heat. This was not the hovel of a fool. It was a sanctuary. He, the man who had offered her $1 for her land, the man who had called her preparations a folly, was now a beggar at her door, pleading for the life of his family. Ilara looked at him, at his frost-bitten face and his terrified eyes. She remembered his condescending tone, the town's collective mockery, the sting of the nickname they had given her. A bitter, cold part of her wanted to say no. She had so little. Her firewood was carefully rationed. Her food was meant to last until spring. To help him would be to risk her own survival. But as she looked at the desperate father, she saw not an enemy, but a human being at the end of his rope. The choice, when it came, was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. She had built this place to live, and what was the point of living if you could not help another who was dying? She stood up. "I'll need the mule," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "We can load a sled." The rescue was an act of sheer will against the fury of nature. She rigged a small sled from pine slabs. She loaded it with precious, seasoned firewood, a significant portion of her winter supply. She added blankets, a sealed pail of hot broth from the chicken she had butchered that morning, and a sack of her largest potatoes. It was a king's ransom in this frozen world. Leading Patience, who was reluctant to leave the warmth of the shelter, she and Shadow guided Mr. Gable back toward Providence Creek. The journey was a nightmare. The wind was a solid wall, driving snow so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The cold was a physical pain, a burning, aching agony that seeped into their bones. Shadow, his fur caked with ice, stayed close, his presence a small, vital comfort. More than once Mr. Gable stumbled and fell, and Ilara had to haul him to his feet, her own strength beginning to fail. They were guided only by her memory of the land and an unshakable resolve. When they finally staggered into the town, it was like arriving in a ghost land. The houses were silent, half buried in snow, their windows dark. They reached the Gable cabin, and the cold that hit them when they opened the door was even more bitter than the wind outside. Mr. Gable's wife and daughter were huddled under a pile of blankets, their breathing shallow. Ilara did not hesitate. She got a fire roaring in the hearth with her dry wood, the flames a desperate, hungry yellow in the gloom. She heated the broth and forced the warm liquid into the mother and child. She worked with a quiet, grim efficiency, her face set. News of their arrival spread like wildfire through the freezing town. A light in the gable window, the smell of smoke. It was a signal of hope. Soon others came, their faces gaunt with cold and hunger. They saw the fire, the food, the exhausted but alive woman who had come from the hills. And they saw the sled, loaded with the currency of life. The next day the storm broke. A small party of men, led by Elias, made the journey to her shelter for more supplies. When Elias stepped inside the mud nest, he stopped dead, his mouth falling open. The warmth hit him first, a deep, enveloping heat that felt like a summer afternoon. His eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. Then he saw it all. The healthy animals in their clean pens, the chickens clucking softly, the impossible rows of green plants growing in their beds against the far wall. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the organized shelves of preserved food, the steady, clean water trickling into the cistern. He ran his hand along the smooth, hard clay of the wall. It was warm, radiating a gentle, life-giving energy. This was no mud nest. This was an ark. A self-contained world, perfectly designed, perfectly executed. He looked at the simple, ingenious systems, the thermal mass, the sheltered animals, the subterranean garden, and he felt a wave of shame so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He and the entire town had mocked her. They had called her a fool for burrowing into the dirt while they slowly froze to death in their proper houses of wood and air. He turned to Alara, who was quietly measuring out bags of potatoes and flour. His face, which had always held a look of smug superiority, was now humbled, broken. "We called it a mud nest," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My God, Alara, we were the fools. We were the ones living in sticks." Alara paused, her hands dusty with flour. She looked at her brother-in-law, the man who had cast her out, who had laughed at her home. She saw the shame in his eyes, the dawning, painful respect. There were 100 things she could have said. "I told you so. You were wrong. You left me with nothing." But she said none of them. Her victory needed no words. It was all around them, in the warmth of the air, in the smell of the living earth, in the quiet miracle of her survival. She simply pushed a heavy sack of potatoes toward him. "Your family will need these," she said, her voice even. "Tell the others to keep their fires low and steady. It uses less wood. And bank the embers with ash at night. The heat will last till morning." Her grace was more stunning than any accusation. She was not offering forgiveness. She was offering knowledge. She was offering life. In that moment she ceased to be the outcast widow. She became their teacher. In the weeks that followed the great freeze of '83, as Providence Creek slowly thawed and came back to life, the town's relationship with Alara underwent a profound transformation. The people no longer spoke of the mud nest woman with scorn or pity. They spoke her name, Alara, with a deep and quiet reverence. They came to her not for charity, but for counsel. Men who had built a dozen cabins in their lifetimes came to the hollow, hats in hand, to ask how she had mortared her stones, how she had banked the earth against her walls, how she had captured the heat of a simple fire. Elias was among the first, his pride replaced by a student's humility. He spent days helping her repair the damage the storm had done, learning as he worked. The nickname for her home remained, but its meaning was inverted. The mud nest was no longer an insult. It became a title of honor, a landmark, a symbol of a wisdom the town had been too arrogant to see. Travelers passing through would hear the story of the blizzard and ask to see the legendary home that had weathered the storm. They would stand on the ridge, just as Elias had once stood to laugh, and they would stare down in awe at the simple, powerful ingenuity of the structure. The impact on Providence Creek was permanent. No new home was ever built there again without considering the lessons of the mud nest. New cabins were dug into hillsides, their north walls made of thick stone and earth. Fireplaces were redesigned to maximize thermal mass. Root cellars were expanded into subterranean larders. Alara's principles, working with the land, not against it, harnessing the earth's natural insulation and warmth, became the foundation of a new kind of frontier architecture. The settlement, once on the brink of extinction, became known for its resilience, its homes famous for their warmth and security. Years passed. Alara never left the hollow. She expanded her home, adding new rooms dug from the clay, a small greenhouse with salvaged glass windows, a larger pen for her animals. Her life remained one of quiet, solitary purpose. She never gloated, never reminded the people of Providence Creek of their past folly. She didn't have to. Her existence was reminder enough. She would sit outside her home on warm spring evenings, Shadow, now old and gray, resting at her feet, and watch the sunset paint the sky above the valley. She was no longer the discarded widow. She was the woman who had listened to the earth when no one else would. She had been given a worthless plot of land, a place of mud and rock, and from it she had built not just a shelter, but a legacy. Her triumph was not over the community that had scorned her or the storm that had tried to break her. It was a quieter, more profound victory, a testament to the enduring power of a single, stubborn refusal to be defeated. She had found her strength not in fighting the wilderness, but in making it her ally.